The conflict between Israel and Palestine, once again sparking a debate about how the media is covering that war, but perhaps more important is the safety of media personnel as they cover a raging war. And we're going to try and understand now why some news outlets seem to be taking sides. At least that is part of the accusation as you hear the debates going on between this particular war between Hamas and the Israeli military. Let's speak now to William Bird. He is from Media Monitoring Africa, joining us for this conversation. William, thank you very much for your time. I, as a journalist, have never covered a war situation. Perhaps let's deal with that first. A number of media personnel are said to have been killed, and at the last count, there were about 7 journalists that were killed in this raging war between Israel and Hamas. What are the safety precautions? Because some of these people, we are told, are wearing gear that is visible for anyone to see, that you cannot point a weapon toward a media practitioner.
Yeah, you know, it's obviously tragic when journalists are killed just for doing their job. We know that that happens not only in this particular conflict, but it happens, you know, the world over. And I think that one of the issues that speaks to is the general decline in trust and credibility around journalists and journalism, you know, because if journalists are seen and understood to be people that are there to tell accurate, verifiable, evidence-based stories, then they're less likely to be seen as targets. We know that sometimes, you know, journalists get killed because they're in the line of fire. We know that they may be in the wrong place at the wrong time, but we know also from South Africa's experience in high conflict areas and, you know, community protests where people are protesting about any number of things, that journalists are no longer seen as people that are there to be on the side of the community, to be telling their stories and sharing their views. And very often that's resulted in a number of our journalists themselves being attacked, being subjected to violence or threats just for being there and for trying to do their jobs.
Yeah.
So this is a problem that goes beyond this particular conflict. This speaks to the recognition of the importance and the role that journalists play in our society. And you know, one of the things that links to that is very much that issue of media bias and the role that media plays. You know, when you've got someone like Elon Musk actively dissuading people from trusting credible, reputable media, that has an impact, because it says, you know, they don't have any particular special role. Yet journalists are the ones that are going there, risking their lives to be there to give us a sense of what's actually going on.
Yeah. We'll talk in a moment, William, about exactly what you've just said. Media bias, that then has a connotation on trust and credibility. But I want to focus the attention on what can be changed in how media can take care of themselves in a war situation. What needs to change about the warring parties in order for them to respect the work of journalists?
Well, I mean, again, part of that is about respect for international law and general principles, and that's essential. It also means that states need to make it clear and unambiguous that if you target and attack and kill a journalist, that's just not acceptable. You know, that must be considered a war crime, regardless of which side they're on, or regardless of where that journalist stands in the way that they report, precisely because you need those people there in order to tell us and give us a different and better sense of what's actually going on. Part of it also is that, you know, we've seen our newsrooms being decimated. I don't think that there are many journalists in South Africa that still receive training on how to report and be in conflict zones. Many of them are there and they do their job because they've been doing it for so long. But, you know, our journalists need formal conflict training. They need to learn what to do in a conflict situation, how to best protect themselves, where to go, things to do. There are very specialized ways and methods of making sure that journalists can be a lot safer in those kinds of scenarios. But very often these days, journalists aren't getting that kind of training. So they are being put in especially risky situations where they have to rely on their own sense of how to be safe in those without having had, specialized training on being in a conflict zone. And that's, on a level, is completely crazy, right? Because you get soldiers are trained on, how to defend and kill people. That's what they are trained in. Journalists who go into those reporting situations need to know how to stay safe in those scenarios.
Yeah. As we earlier alluded, William, the issue of journalists and how they report, particularly in conflict situations. I'd like for you to listen now to a permanent observer to the United Nations, but for Palestine. Let's just take a listen to what Riyad Mansour had to say.
Regrettably, history for some media and politicians start when Israelis are killed. Our people have endured one deadly year after another. We came to the Security Council month after month, warning of the consequences of Israeli impunity and international inaction. Last October, about a year ago, we stated before the Security Council, the Palestinian people will be free, one day or another, one way or another.
William, my takeaway from that particular comment, and you'll correct me here if I'm interpreting it wrong, the understanding, or what I think seems to be the complaint, is that there is mass hysteria, particularly from the side of the Western media, when citizens of Israel are killed. And yet, there has been a long-standing complaint about the people of Palestine who live in occupied territories who are dying on a daily, and those perhaps sometimes go unreported. And so it's as if there is this understanding that when Israelis are killed, these are human beings, these are people who are decent and who should not be victimized in this way, and Palestinians somewhat seen as subhuman. Am I oversimplifying the matter here?
No, I mean, I think that's a critique that has been and continues to be leveled with varying forms of legitimacy, globally. Very often, if you talk about, when Africans die on our own continent, for them to make the news on any substantial level, they need to die in numbers. If there's a disaster, if there's a conflict, I mean, the coup in Niger, do we understand the consequences of that? Do we understand, how people are dying and what the intricate causes are of that and the nuances of that? No, we generally get to see it only at the moment that there's an actual coup there. And we go, oh gosh, that seems to have come out of the blue. So there is, fundamentally a very different way in which different parts of the world and their people are represented. We know in South Africa, for example, it was a tradition of apartheid coverage that white lives mattered and black lives didn't. And you saw that being carried through in all sorts of ways. And so I think there's very real and legitimate concern about the manner in which the lives of those being lost in this particular conflict now are being reported. And I think that, again, that speaks to the role and importance of media saying our default position is that the dignity and of people and equality of people matters regardless of their ethnicity, their nationality, their religious persuasion. Those things don't matter. We're going to, from our part, take every step that we possibly can to give dignity and equality to all of those people, right? And in South Africa, we've got an especially greater motivation to do that, precisely because of the history of our media in South Africa as not having done that at all. We've a history of, our South African media history only in the last 30 years has made meaningful efforts to give dignity and equality to all people, regardless of their race, nationality, etc., particularly on the basis of race. So when people make that claim now, I think they've got very real and legitimate concerns. Of course, what that tends to then feed into is, this media is necessarily biased and they're necessarily taking this view on this particular conflict. Because one of the other problems with news media, and we've raised this before, is that when you look at something like xenophobia in South Africa, we know it's there.
Yeah.
When it's there on a daily basis, it's not going to make the news on a daily basis. It will make the news when there's a violent outburst, when people are being attacked, when people are being killed, as an example, right? And it's the same thing here. So yes, there's a legitimate cause to say people need to understand context in a broader way. We need to understand what's been happening in that zone before it gets to this point. Because again, the way that news tends to operate is it focuses on the big event. It focuses on the explosion, the bomb, the fire, the flood, the earthquake. And very seldom do we give it the run-in time to provide the kind of context. Of course, there are media that do provide that. So talking in these terms of the media as if it's one amorphous thing, I also think is inaccurate. So,
Sure.
There are lots of excellent media that have been reporting on this conflict and its brewing and that have led us to this tragic consequence where we are now, that have been reporting on that for years, if not decades, local and international media. There are excellent media that have been doing that. There's no doubt.
Final question to you, and I think it's something that is quite poignant. You may have pointed to a little earlier. You've mentioned that we've made great strides here in South Africa to try and deal with these issues. But with the complaint that newsrooms more and more are becoming juniorized, in other words, there are very young journalists who may not necessarily have the training. Do you think that training is being neglected somewhat? And that could have its own consequences about how we as media cover such issues going forward.
I mean, there's no doubt, and it's not necessarily that it's the juniorization in terms of age, but more about the failure to build skills, provide mentorship, and provide people with the kind of input to what they're doing. Also because very few newsrooms in our country, or globally in fact, seem to take the time to say, these are our newsroom values. We are fundamentally opposed to violence because it undermines all other rights. And when we report on something, we need to approach it with that frame of mind that says that violence is a bad thing, and because it undermines other rights. Similarly, we are reporting on racism as fundamentally a bad thing because equally it undermines all other rights. Same thing with xenophobia, so that when people say xenophobic things on air, they need to be challenged on that basis, precisely because if you don't, it then allows those things to carry on those stereotypes to be perpetuated. And so the juniorization is one thing, but I think it's about the fact that we need to be, providing ongoing mentorship, skills development and building and guidance for the very few journalists that are there. The problem, of course, though, now is that there are very few senior people and people that have got that experience to do this. And when you then get an incredibly challenging kind of conflict like this, where there are very clear sides and there are lots of nuance and there's lots of division, and it's happening, frankly, thousands and thousands of miles away, to get people to understand and how do we report that and what's our approach, as opposed to going and saying, okay, well, I've seen these 3 international feeds, let's just take this and let's give our own take on it and think that, that's going to do. Because honestly, there's 10,000 stories happening in South Africa today, and the journalist simply doesn't have the time to even think about how is this going to make the conflict feel? Does it give balance and equitability to both sides? Are we being fair to the Israelis and the Palestinians? And are we making sure that we're giving dignity and equality? Those sort of things have to come in split-second decisions. And without that that deliberate, explicit, intentional mentoring of journalists. That isn't going to happen. And so we're in a downward spiral in terms of quality of reporting, sadly.
You make a very good point. Thank you very much for your time and insights here. William Bird is with the Media Monitoring Africa. All right.